There's nothing out there that can hurt you, and if you experience any fear, it's all in your head. There's nothing out there that can hurt you, and if you experience any fear, it's all in your head. That's what this old timer who worked at the treatment center where I was currently a patient at said to me as I was getting ready to hike out into the desert on this 3 day quest where I was going on this spiritual journey to find myself or to face my fears or to seek a vision, whatever it was. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I couldn't understand what that guy meant at the time. There's nothing that can hurt you out there in the desert, and if you experience any fear, it's all in your head. The bottom line is, I think there's a lot of stuff out there that could hurt me. And the fact is, I thought I was going to die a short while later out there when I got out there. Bottom line is, I didn't die. Nothing hurt me. And I ended up full of fear the whole time I was out there. And it wasn't until much later today, I can understand what that guy meant about if you experience any fear, it's all in your head. That was pretty woo-woo kind of sounding stuff at the time for me. But what I'm going to do today is tell you my story of when I went out there into the desert. Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Savage. If I haven't had the chance to meet you yet, I really appreciate you stopping by and listening. This is Wednesday Woo. This is my 5th week of doing this. I've been coming on live every Wednesday, and I'm talking about topics that are near and dear to my heart that are all related to the various spiritual aspects of recovery. And this talk today is sort of a culmination of what we've been talking about the last several weeks. The first week, you can go back and find these on YouTube or on our Facebook group page, and you can watch these talks if you didn't hear them before. But first talk, I talked my Val Kilmer story, where I gave my history of becoming dedicated to helping people in treatment and in recovery explore the spiritual aspects of recovery. And in specific, my history of learning about spiritual traditions in doing vision quests and leading vision quests with clients in treatment for many, many years. The vision quest is going to figure into this talk today. I talked about the Carl Jung premise about his ideas on how he sees our addiction as directly related to our desire for a spiritual experience. I'm going to suggest that me wanting to go out into that desert is an example of, I don't know what I was getting myself into, but I want to do something. I want to have that thing happen for me. And then last week, we talked about the shadow, and you see here in the title, The Owl, the Desert, and the Shadow. It's only fitting, this talk I've been giving for years with this title, and I included the shadow in here. So this is going to pick up directly on what we were talking about last week, that recovery is shadow work. It's all about moving into the darkness and exploring the darkness. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, I've been telling this story. I used to tell it my first year in recovery. I'd tell this in support group meetings, and I would tell all the woo-woo stuff in here, and I didn't really understand at the time. Not quite fitting for certain support group meetings, and also it would take me about 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and that's sort of a long share. And I finally learned that, okay, we'll leave the Owl, the Desert, the Shadow story out of the support group meetings. But over the years, when I ran my own treatment center, I would occasionally, we'd have movie night with Uncle Jim, and I'd tell my story about when I went out in the desert. And I haven't told this story for a long time. And since I started doing this Wednesday Woo stuff, I thought, oh, this is the perfect setting because trust me, there's some woo-woo stuff that happened out there in the desert, and I'm going to tell you all the gory details of that today. So with that, let me go to this slide here. I'm trying to be organized and, follow the format of a structured presentation. Tell them what you're going to talk about it, and then tell them what you talked about. Here, so I actually made a slide with some bullet points, some of the things I'm going to cover today through this talk. Fear, meditation, vision quest, owl medicine. Watch this. Are you ready for this? When I was getting ready, looking at myself in the screen, and I took a sip of coffee, look what I noticed. What coffee cup is he using today? The Gemini coffee cup that happens to have 2 owls on the coffee cup. Coincidence? I think not. Or maybe that's sort of woo-woo stuff, huh? We're going to talk about owl medicine today. The desert as a metaphor, and ultimately we're going to talk about the disease of addiction because that's where this is all going. My objective for sharing this story on a serious level of the woo-woo stuff aside, it culminates in I came out of the desert with a profound lesson, vision, whatever you want to call it, specifically about my attitude, how I should regard my disease of addiction and my attitude towards recovery. And I share that with other people for any way that can help. Obviously, I'm going to touch on these other bullet points that you see here in the slide. Not go into too much detail on any of them, but there's going to be some discussion about all those things, and you might pick up things on any of those various topics here. So let's start this story. I'm going to go back to this original slide here. The story starts in 1988. I was a relapsed drug counselor. I had begun, I say that sort of in air quotes, I'd begun recovery. Didn't get sober. I had begun messing around with recovery, calling myself sober like 5 years earlier. I got sober. I went to school and became a drug counselor. And I sort of did that instead of going to meetings and working a recovery program. I thought that I was learning more about recovery by becoming a drug counselor. And the bottom line is I never really worked a recovery program, never understood what true recovery was. But I, took off in the field, and as the disease of addiction is wont to do, I relapsed because I did not manage the condition. And I ended up with a meeting in my backyard one day with loved ones and friends who were there because they cared about me and they loved me, and they had a plane ticket, and they said, "Jim, you're going to treatment." And I lived in Dallas, Texas at the time, and they sent me to Arizona for treatment. And so the story literally began that day, May 2nd, 1988. That's my sobriety date. And I had never been to Arizona before. I'd never been to that part of the country. I'd never seen a desert before. And so the story literally starts when I walked up to the gate of the treatment center. Hadn't even checked in yet, but there was a gate there, and it had a sign hanging over the gate that said, "Expect a miracle." And I looked at that sign, in this picture that you see here. I'll zoom in on this a little bit. I think I can do this, right? That's what I saw as I was looking at that sign that said, "Expect a miracle." I looked out there in the desert because this picture here was taken. I finally went back out there. I hadn't gone back to, this was in Tucson, in the Tucson area. I hadn't been there for years. This was like 6 or 7 years ago that I finally went back there, and I went to that place. And I stood at that place where that sign was. They've moved the treatment center across the road now, so it's not exactly the same, but that's where the gate was. And I looked out into that desert, and I had one of those burning bush, white light kind of moments where I was standing there and I was looking out in the desert, and I sort of literally heard a voice in my head, and it said, "You're spiritually bankrupt, and if anything's going to happen for you, it's going to happen out there," meaning out there in the desert. Like I said, I'd never been to the desert. I'd never seen the desert before. And also, prior to that, I was not a spiritual guy. I wasn't an anti-spiritual guy. I wasn't one that was, angry about God or didn't believe in God. I sort of believed in God, I guess. I was really flatline about spirituality. But again, the thought that came, heard the voice, you're spiritually bankrupt. If anything is going to happen for you, it's going to happen out there. I had no idea what that meant. I just walked into the treatment center and began the humiliating, painful, dark experience of being a relapsed drug counselor in drug treatment and having to go through all the shadow work of getting honest with myself and facing myself really for the first time ever. So, treatment, actually, what made me decide to give this talk today, I got a message. I have a friend who's currently in treatment, and I got a message from him the other day. It was Sunday, and he said something about that we went on our outing today. And I remembered, yes, Sundays in rehab. That's, programming's a little lighter, and we go on field trips and things like that. And at our treatment center, they would, on Sunday mornings, they'd have vans that would take, clients if they wanted to go to churches. And they also had the alternative spirituality guy who would come in and lead some groups, and every treatment center has the alternative spirituality guy, right? I became one of those alternative spirituality guys myself. That's what I do now. But so his name was Mike. And he would come in and he'd bring the drums and the musical instruments and sticks, and we'd click the sticks together and we'd dance. And then he'd sometimes, whoever wanted to, in the afternoon, he'd lead a hike out into the desert. And I started doing that, and I really clicked with that. I started getting into it, but one of the things that I noticed on the hikes out in the desert, people would find little pieces of crystal or turquoise or find a feather or something, and we'd find meaning to it, and again, sort of the woo-woo-y kind of stuff. And I remember one day realizing I felt like a cosmic catastrophe. I felt so disconnected, like there's no part of me that can connect with this stuff. And other people are finding the crystals and stuff, and I wasn't finding anything. And at some point, Mike talked about the fact that he would take people out on solos, where he would take them out overnight and let them sit by themselves out there in the desert and confront their fears or whatever it is that you would do out there. And that sort of got my attention. I thought, ooh, I'd like to do that. And I talked to my counselor about it and said, I'd like to, maybe when I discharge, I'd like to ask Mike to take me out there. And I was actually sort of confronting, I was starting to look at my issues of how grandiose I was and full of myself and all those character defects. And I wasn't sure if it was arrogant and, me thinking, I want to do everything. And and if it was really sort of a character defect wanting to do that. But the counselor said, well, I'll talk to Mike about it, see what he says. And so the next Sunday that he came, we went out on a hike in the desert that afternoon. and I didn't know if they'd talked or not, and I was a little gun shy of talking to him about this, and I didn't know if he would, say anything about it. And at some point, he came up to me. He said, your counselor talked to me and said, you want to go out in the desert? And I said, well, yeah, I just sort of thought that it would be sort of cool. It sounds sort of cool. And he said, I'm not going to be in town that week that you get discharged. And okay, well, whatever. He said, but you could do it yourself. You go out by yourself. And I'm like, he goes, no, I'll draw you a map, and you could go out there and you can do this by yourself. And I'm actually going to, I've got I'll zoom in here a little closer. You see where I put this box there? This is really, I don't know any of you are looking at this, some of you are looking at this on your phone probably. I don't know how well you can see this stuff. It's tough to get a context of how vast this was. That white spot in the center of that box, that was a cliff. These are the foothills of mountains. And that biggest white spot was like a foothill type of thing, where he said you can hike out to that rock, the big rock, but it's bigger than a rock. That's like, that white is like the size of a football field. And that dark shaded area in the front of it, that's like a 100-foot cliff, to give you an idea of the size of what this was. And so Mike was telling me, he said, you can go out there and climb up there and sit on top of that and do your thing. And I was like, I don't know, that sounds sort of dangerous or sort of scary. But we continued in our walk that day. And so we're walking around, and at one point I look down, and guess what's sitting there on the ground right in front of me? I find a feather. And it isn't just a little tiny feather, it's a big feather. This is like a real feather of something special or something like this. And I was sort of excited. Oh, look at this. I found a feather. As a matter of fact, I happen to have this. Let's do this. This is the feather that I found. This would be an owl feather. And the little cross here, the stick thing, it's seen better days. This is 35 years old, right? The wood stuff, the cross thing, this is what we made in alternative spirituality arts and crafts one Sunday. We were, making things, and I made this with my feather. And this is my owl feather that I found that day. Put that away. And so I found that, and I was feeling sort of excited about that. And at one point we stopped to have some water, and I showed Mike the feather, and I said, hey, what kind of feather is this? Is this like from a real bird, right? This is like a hawk or something? And I remember Mike's look on his face when he saw it. It was a genuine, like, concern. He wasn't laughing. He goes, where'd you get that? And I said, I found it on the trail back there. I said, you walked right over it. You didn't see it evidently. Maybe it wasn't there when he walked by, and then all of a sudden it was there. I don't know. But I said, what is it, a hawk feather? And he said, no, that's an owl feather. And I said, okay, what's it mean? And he said, owl feather. He said, that's a symbol of the owl's symbol of the other side. The owl flies out into the darkness. Some traditions, I've learned a lot more about owl medicine than what I knew at that time, or just the brief thing that he told me that day. He said the owl, in some traditions they call it the night eagle. The owl hunts in the night. It's the ability to see in the darkness. And he said, to explore, to go in some cultures, it's a symbol of death. In some cultures, or another interpretation is it's a symbol of, you'll see the word deception written with owl medicine, but really what the deception is, it's the death, or I should say what the death is the death to deception. The ability to get into the darkness and not be deceived by the darkness, but to be able to see clearly. I pulled something up here on the internet. You know, there's a book called, or a deck of cards book called The Medicine Cards, and I think this comes from that. I pulled this quote just off of something else. I found off the internet the pictures from The Medicine Cards by Jamie Sams. It's a book by Jamie Sams. And here's one thing. If you've pulled the owl card, you're being asked to use your powers of keen, silent observation to intuit some life situation. Owl is befriending you and aiding you in seeing the total truth. Owl can bring you messages in the night through dreams or meditation. Pay attention to the signals and the omens. Let's just remember that. For example, that silent observation, you know, another example of owl medicine, we can go a little further into this. Owl feathers are sometimes called deceiver feathers because an owl feather is different than other bird feathers because the edges of them are soft, meaning it doesn't make any noise when it flies. It can hunt at night. And that's where I think, the keen, silent observation to intuit life situations. I think that's maybe where that comes from. We pay attention to the deceiver feathers. But as the story goes on, let's just pay attention. Owl can bring you messages in the night through dreams or meditation. Pay attention to the signals or the omens. So Mike was saying to me, he goes, I don't think it's any coincidence that you found this today, because he said, that's exactly what you're talking about doing here by wanting to go out into the desert. You're wanting to go out and explore the other side, the shadow side, the dark side. You're going within yourself is really what that's about, to do shadow work. But also that owl, again, it gets connotations of death. And as I talked about in one of our talks, the medicine wheel or the hero's journey, a cyclical process. Recovery is a cyclical process that involves a death and a rebirth. And so, in a sense, any type of rite of passage, like a vision quest, is going out to go through a symbolic death. The idea, leaving the old self behind, coming back in a new person. And Mike understood all that, even though I didn't quite understand that at the time. He said, that's what you're talking about doing. That's what you're wanting to do. So he gave me instructions to go out there by myself. And so what ended up happening is, like 2 weeks later, I discharged from treatment, and I didn't do a ceremonial vision quest like I learned how to do years later and led other people through that. I got a ride into town, rented some camping gear, came back to the treatment center, and I walked out into the desert from there to camp for a couple days. I was going to go pitch my tent on top of that big rock. Now, one thing I'll say is there was another patient there who was teaching me about meditation. I had no idea. I'd never talked about meditation. I remember that was the first time I ever got the first cursory explanations of meditation. And he told me, when you're sitting up there on the rock, just try not to think about anything and see what comes to your mind. But the point he was saying is, don't think about anything. And this is a valuable thing. I teach people this today because the biggest thing we struggle with meditation is clearing our mind, right? And I still hear that guy. He was a Native American guy, and so he had sort of an accent, and I can still remember he would say, and the thing is, don't worry about it if stuff clutters your mind. If you're sitting up there and a thought about coyote comes into your mind, go, hello, coyote. Goodbye, coyote. Just let it go and continue your meditation. That was valuable for me, just hearing that. If a thought comes, greet the thought. Oh, okay, I don't need your thought right now. You can go now and continue with your meditation. So that was an interesting thing because I was going to go out there to meditate, right? Now, there was another guy who was a patient there. He happened to be a counselor, treatment counselor too, who was in treatment. And he lived out there, and so he was familiar with the desert. And he walked with me down to the fence where I was going out. And and as we were getting ready, as I was getting ready to leave, he said to me when we were walking down to the fence, he goes, "Do you have a gun with you?" I said, "No, I don't have a gun. I got a knife." And he said, "I never go out there without a gun." And I was like, "Huh?" And he said, "Well, good luck." And this was in May, or this would have been June. I was in treatment for a month, and so this is June. It was really hot. It was getting well into the 110 degree, 115 degrees, maybe 120, I don't know, out there. And so I didn't leave until till late afternoon, early evening. I was trying not to hike during the day. So I went out about 6 o'clock. And so the first night I start walking out there, and Mike had given me this map of how to get out to this boulder out there. And so I go out there on the first night, and I walk for about an hour, and it was getting dark, and it was starting to get a little creepy. And so first thing, if I experience any fear, it's all in my head. I had to make this decision I could either walk across this ridge or go through this a lower spot in sort of this grove of juniper trees. And I went through the low spot, and it was dark in there, and I remember getting a little creeped out. And I don't even know what I was afraid of, right? But I was experiencing a little bit of fear. And no big deal. I ended up pitching my tent. I went out to gather some firewood to build a fire. And I was breaking some wood, and my main reason for having a knife, I had some food. It was going to be my can opener also to open my food. And I was breaking some wood, and I put the knife down on the ground, and I grabbed a bundle of wood, and I went back, and the knife was gone. And I couldn't find the knife anywhere. And I literally looked all around for a while, and it was gone. And I had done nothing but just set it down there. And I started, that's the only weapon that I have, is my knife. And that's like, what happened to it? It's sort of a woo-woo kind of disappeared. Like, it was right there. And so the fear started settling in on, I don't have a weapon out here. And that guy said, "You got a gun. You need to have a weapon out here." And so I got a little afraid. But, I pitched my tent. I climbed into my tent. And I got up the next morning really early. As soon as it started getting light out, try to hike during the first part of the day. And I started, and I was following the map, and there was a trail. And at one point, I was hiking along, and I found myself into some sort of thick bush, and I realized at some point I've gotten off the trail, and that Mike had drawn out on this map. And I turned around, I went back, and the next thing I knew, I was sort of lost in this thick bush stuff. And I realized I can't find the trail. And that was another point where some fear entered in. And all I'm doing here is I'm sort of chronicling little examples of fear that again, not real big stuff, but fear, because this fear is a major topic here today, right? And so that was another thing. I'm lost. And I had that first feeling of, what would happen if I got lost out here? And eventually, I don't know, I found the trail again. And interestingly enough, as soon as I saw the trail, I saw a big set of clearly very fresh footprints. And they were really big footprints, and I was very clear right away they were mountain lion footprints. And they were going down the trail where I was heading. And that brought some fear, because they looked fresh. And I thought, there's a mountain lion and I got to follow it. And even there's some symbolism when I hear myself say, I was following in the mountain lion's footprints, and I had to follow that, and there was fear in that. I had no idea when if I was going to come around a turn and come face to face with it, but I was having to keep going through that, and I was getting more afraid. At that point, an hour or two into this, it was starting to get a little warmer. I started becoming aware of, it's sort of hot out here. And I remember starting to see little funny things in my eyes playing tricks on me. And that was the first awareness of how you could get a little loopy out there in the desert. And that added a little fear. And so then I got to this one place, came out and is opened up this field. And all of a sudden, I realized, oh, there's the rock hill that if you look down in the right-hand corner of the blue square that I drew, that's where I would be talking about. There's a dark ridge that goes down there, and that's actually that dark area is a bunch of rocks. It's a lava flow that was coming down that ridge from the mountains. And Mike had drawn that on the map. He called that the Boulder Staircase. He said, you're going to have to climb over these big rocks and get to the other side of that. But once you get through them, then it's pretty clear sailing. And so when I started to go across the Boulder Staircase, I was climbing over these rocks, and I also, heard from the old timer. He said, remember, don't put your foot down any place that you can't see where you're putting your foot down. The place was full of rattlesnakes out there, right? And this rocky area that I had to climb through was a haven for rattlesnakes. And I was terrified having to walk across this Boulder Staircase. And I had a hiking stick. And so I was terrified, but people said, just make noise. And so I go across this Boulder Staircase, and I'm banging the stick on the rocks, and I was literally yelling and saying, I'm going through the Boulder Staircase, and any rattlesnakes, you get out of my way. And I was having to put my foot down between rocks, and I couldn't see where I was putting them, and I was terrified that whole time going through the Boulder Staircase. But got through it unharmed, didn't even see a rattlesnake. And then I was on the other side of that Boulder Staircase, and then it was just one basically clear field up to the face of the big rock that I was hiking towards. And then I had this thought at that moment, I'm almost there. This isn't as hard as I thought it was going to be, or as challenging as I thought it was going to take longer to get out, and I thought it was going to be tougher. And I sort of had this attitude of, well, this isn't that hard. I want something harder. Famous last words. But, because I thought I'm going to be there in 45 minutes. And so I walk across this field, and then, so I get up to the face of this rock. And to get up to the top of it, I don't know, again, if you can see this. I could do this. If you can see this, I was entering it. I approached it from the right side of it, the lower right side of that big white round thing there in the center of the square. To get up to it, I had to walk all the way across the face of that to the other side where it was a little bit more of a accessible hill to hike up to get up to the top of that. And so to walk across it, that was, again, that was a cliff. And I could either walk, well in front of it through this deep grass and tree kind of stuff, brush kind of stuff. And that didn't feel real safe because, again, I wasn't supposed to be walking where I couldn't see my feet. Or I could sort of climb across the rocky part of it a little higher up. And so I chose to do that. So I start going across the rock face of the front of this hill. And it's getting sort of hairy. I had a big heavy pack on my back, and I'm sort of jumping from rocks to rocks. And I was also, at that time, starting to become aware of how hot it was. It was starting to get pretty hot, and I had like quart bottles of water with me. And I was starting to realize how much water I needed. I was getting the awareness. This is sort of like gasoline. For every X amount of energy I expend, for distance I would walk, I would need another cup of water. I could literally feel my body needing the water, and so I was getting a little nervous about that. It was getting pretty hot out, and so at one point, I'm standing on this rock, and I gotta jump over to this other rock and pull myself up over this ledge, and so I sort of have to jump, I pull, and I've committed to pulling myself up onto this ledge. And as I come up over the ledge, there's a bush on top of this ledge, and sticking out of the bush is this big tail. And it's a lizard tail. It was black and yellow, speckled, big, lizardy, scaly, that's what they call it. And I was like, and it was like the Psycho scene, the shower scene in Psycho, where all of a sudden, all my fears, the rattlesnakes that I thought were out there and everything that could harm me, it all came to life. And it was, I was like, oh my God, there's a real animal right there. And I was committed, and I had to pull myself up onto the ledge. And I get up on top of the ledge, and I'm standing there, this bush right in front of me with this big tail sticking out, and I didn't know what it was. I came to find out after I got back, and I went into a bookstore and looked at a book about the desert, and I saw a picture of a Gila monster, and it said, the myth about the Gila monster is that when it bites its prey, it doesn't let go until after the sun goes down. And they explained that the reason of that is, they said the Gila monster is one of two poisonous reptiles in the desert, and it has hundreds of teeth with these clamped jaws, and it injects its poison and grinds. It clamps on, and it holds on for a long time, and it grinds to inject its poison. And there was part of me, it said normally it's docile unless it's provoked. And there was part of me, I stood there looking at it, and I was terrified of it, but there was also a little part of me wanting to poke it and see what it was. And it's a good thing that I didn't. But here is where that to get off that ledge, the only way off that ledge, there was no way around this. I had to get to the other side of the Gila monster, and I had to literally step over the Gila monster. And I was like, oh my God, what have I done? And I looked at that, and I was sitting there staring at it, and all of a sudden I hear this commotion, and I hear this ruffling of wings, it sounds like, and I hear this, and all of a sudden there's commotion, and I look across, this is the middle of the day, right? And I see flying straight at me a big owl, great horned owl, flying straight at me. And I'm standing here on the ledge, the Gila monster is right down here, and the owl's flying right at me. And I'm looking, and it flies right by me. And Mike had said, he had used the term courage to explore the unknown. That's what he had sort of interpreted that owl feather as meaning. And it was almost like when he flew by me, he looked at me, and I heard those words, courage to explore the unknown. And I was like, and I had this owl feather with me. And I was figuring, this is probably his feather. I found it out here in the desert where he's flying around. And I thought, okay, courage to explore the unknown. And I stepped over the Gila monster, and I got off that ledge, and I kept going. 45 minutes later, this was becoming increasingly difficult, um, traversing across these rocks and stuff. And I pulled myself up onto another ledge. I had to sort of jump to this ledge, and I found myself in a situation where I couldn't get off the ledge. I couldn't go back the way that I came, and there was no way to get to the next place. And I thought, this is it. I can't get off this thing. And I really thought I was stranded. And I can't conjure up the feeling right now just telling this. I thought, this is it. I looked up at this canyon I was in, and it was getting really hot, and I was getting really thirsty, and I was afraid of running out of water, and I was stranded on this ledge. And I thought to myself, you got what you wanted. Nobody knows where you are. And I realized this is how people die. They go out, they get lost in the desert. You hear about people getting lost out in the wherever, in the desert or the woods or whatever. And this is how it happens. Because I thought, I can't get off this thing. And right as I was thinking about dying, and again, I can't say it as serious as I felt it at the time. I was terrified. I was that moment of really thinking I'm looking death in the face. Right at that moment that I was having that thought, I hear the commotion again, and the next thing I know, the owl comes flying back at me again. And he comes flying by me again, and I hear the words, courage to explore the unknown. And I don't remember how I did it. I got off that ledge. Bottom line is, I got to the edge of that rock. I went around. I climbed up the side of it, and I got to the top of that rock. Let's pull this up again here, and I got up to the top, and I thought, this is it. I'm on top of the world. I could see for miles down this valley, and oh, this is incredible, isn't it? And I'm going to have this really spiritual experience up here, and I'm going to be blissful and in nirvana. And then remember, it was really hot out, pushing 120 degrees, I think. And I got up there and I realized, guess what? There's no shade up here. This is like a football field, a stone football field was all it was. And I was starting to get really hot and really thirsty, and I had like 1 quart of water left, and I was really worried about having enough water to make it. And I was starting to get delirious, and I thought, okay, I'll put up the tent and I can get inside the tent. That'll create some shade. And guess what? I got inside the tent, and it's not, just because it's dark in a tent and shady, it doesn't mean it's any cooler. It's really hot in the tent. And I was suffering. But I was still in that treatment cloud. I was pink cloud. I was out there to meditate. I'd brought my little meditation and my recovery books with me, and I was going to, do recovery stuff out there. I literally found a bush, and I crawled under a bush with my journal or my book, and I was reading something, and I had bugs crawling on me, and I was really getting delirious, but I was trying to do the right thing, and that was sort of, and then so at one point, on the sort of the back edge of this boulder, there was a little rock face that created a little bit of shadow, and I thought, okay, I'm going to try to lay in that shadow, and I'm going to try to sleep. I'm going to try and take a nap. And again, I crossed over into true delirious. I was delirious, and I was looking up at the sun, and I thought, the sun is my enemy. I was looking, it was this big orange thing up in the sky. And I thought, it's never going to set. I just need that sun to set. And I thought it was moving backwards at one point, and it was just this big, ominous presence here. And so again, I thought, I'm going to try to just go. Maybe I can sleep in this shade until the sun sets. And I took my water with me, to put that in the shade in case I would cool it off at all or whatever. And I lay down next to this rock in this little foot and a half of shade, and I sort of doze off, and I'm woken up by a noise. And something disturbed me, and I open my eyes, and as I open my eyes, I see my water bottle rolling forward, and it rolls over the edge of the cliff. And I had this split second where I had to realize I dive for the water. That's my life going over. If I lose that, I'm going to die. And I also knew at the same time, if I dive, there's a good chance I fall over the edge of that cliff and I die too. And so I had this split second, I had to make a decision. What do I do? Do I dive for it or not? And I didn't dive, and I watched my water bottle roll over the edge of the cliff. And I end up to the edge of the cliff, and I look down, and I can see it. It's about 75 feet down, and it's landed in this sort of cave kind of thing. And I was aware that going down there was going to be an extra expenditure of energy. That's where I was at, as far as I was really depleted, and I knew I was going to need more water to climb down and have to get it and climb back up again, but I knew that I had to do it. So I go down there, and when I get down to the bottom, it's underneath, there's sort of this rock overhang, and there's a crevice that it's down like 10 feet down there, and I'm standing above it on an overhang. And I remembered Mike telling me, he goes, remember, if you see any place that looks cool and shady and would be a comfortable place to stay and get out of the sun, something else has probably already found that. And this was really one of those places, sort of a cave that I was standing on top of, and I didn't know if that mountain lion would be sitting in there, if it was javelinas, if it was a rattlesnake den, but I knew my water bottle was down there, and I had to jump down in there to get the water bottle. And so again, and I'll tell you, in treatment, I heard them tell me, it was the first time I heard the phrase, the counselor said something I didn't understand at the time. Your higher power won't give you anything more than you can handle. And that sounds esoteric, and I didn't understand that at the time. But I remembered them saying that as I was looking at the water bottle down there, and they said, your higher power won't give you anything more than you can handle. And I'm like, my God, how much am I supposed to handle? I've got to jump down into that. If I don't, I'm dead. And if I do, I might die. Bottom line is, I jumped down into that thing. I went as fast as I could. I scaled up like a cartoon character, and I got my water bottle. I got out, hiked back up to the top, had to drink some more water, and eventually the sun started to go down. But again, I was in really rough shape. I was so dehydrated and thirsty. But I started to try to meditate. And I was sitting there, and I was staring out over the valley from the top of that boulder there, and I was doing the thing like my friend said, just stare ahead and whatever comes to your mind. I could see the treatment center that I had been at off in the distance, and I'm sitting there staring at the treatment center, and the thought comes to my mind. Oh, I should back up and say this. When I was under the bush with my journal, I was trying to do everything right. And so and they were telling me that if I experienced any fear, it was all in my head. I made a list of everything that I was experiencing fear about that day. I had a long list of things I was paralyzingly terrified of that entire day. I'd made this list. And I'm sitting there staring at the treatment center off in the distance, and the thought comes to my mind, you just spent 30 days there with them trying to teach you you've got a disease that will kill you. And I thought to myself, I ought to be afraid of that. And I got this awareness, this perspective. If I could be, afraid of that as I have been today, as I've spent this entire day afraid of dying, that would probably be a good perspective to regard my disease of addiction with. If I could be as afraid as I've been today of my disease, that's probably going to be a good thing in helping me stay sober. And that was it. That was the vision. I experienced, take all that terror that I had been experiencing and apply that and to the fact that today, 35 years later, I still remember that, and it made me take the attitude of, I'd been a phony recovering person prior to this going to treatment, this relapse that led me to treatment. And I thought that I knew a lot about recovery, and I knew that I needed to come in, drop all the ego, drop all the self-knowledge, and act like a newcomer, and that I had no business not acting like a newcomer to this day. To this day, and you can tell as you hear me saying this, I remember this vividly, and it has been a guiding force in my recovery for 35 years now of remembering I better be afraid. And we're going to talk, I keep saying, we're going to talk about exactly what we mean by fear here. I might replace that word with respect. Have respect for this disease. I better have respect for what this disease can do to me, what I need to do, what effective management of my chronic condition means. And so on that note, let's talk about fear for a second. When that guy said, there's nothing out there that can hurt you. Yeah, there is. There's a lot of stuff that could hurt me. The rattlesnake could bite me. I could die of dehydration. I could fall off one of those ledges. Yes, there are things that could hurt me. But let's talk about, when we talk about fear, because I also understand when he said, if you experience fear, it's in your head. In recovery, we learn a lot. The recovery literature makes a big point about fear. They say it's an evil and corrosive thread that runs through the fabric of our existence. Fear is one of the biggest struggles of the human condition, and it's all mind stuff. And it takes a while to learn about that and how to manage that and understand what that really means. But the one thing that I'll clarify when they say, there's nothing to be afraid of, I'll say, well, yes, there is. The example I give, if I'm crossing the street and a bus is roaring down the street, I better be afraid of the bus, right? And so I'll suggest it's not being afraid of the bus, it's being wise. There's things to be wise about. Don't put your finger in front of the rattlesnake's mouth. If the bus is coming down the street, wisdom would tell me, jump out of the way. Oh, that scared me. For that's the feeling, I guess, is fear. Oh, that scared me. The bus almost ran me over. But it was wisdom. Fear is thinking, I know how things are supposed to be. And fear is about, it's not going to turn out the way that I think it's supposed to be. And again, I'll get into more of this in subsequent Woo talks about understanding fear and understanding our spiritual belief system, etc. But the bottom line is, nothing did hurt me. I was evidently wise enough, I banged the stick to keep the rattlesnakes out of the way. Nothing ended up hurting me, but I was paralyzed with fear. And those were all thoughts in my head because none of that stuff ended up happening. And so the bottom line is what I finally, the sun went down, I had my vision, I better be afraid, I better respect my disease, which 35 years later, I'm able to report it seems to be helping I've got a decent string. I'm very grateful for my recovery today, and that has definitely been a significant factor. What ended up happening the next morning, I got up and I thought, I'm getting the heck out of here. and I was looking through my binoculars. How do I get out of here? I can't go through that again, coming back out here. And I was looking over in the other direction, and I could see not very far. I could see some houses, and I'd make out like a dirt road. And I thought, I'm going that way. And I thought, no, that wouldn't be spiritual. You got to go out the way. That's taking the easy way out. You got to go out the way you came in. But then I had maybe another visionary thought. No, the spiritual quest is you get out any way that you can. That would be wise, right? And so I left. I packed up early that morning and I hiked down the mountain. And I went the other way, and this time the feeling, I felt different. I felt like I knew where I was going, and I had this inner strength that was guiding me. And it wasn't long, a half hour, 45 minutes, I found a road, and I'm walking down this dirt road. And then the next thing I know, there's a house coming up, and I walk up to the house, and it was like a scene out of a movie. Sunday morning, I think it was a Sunday, I don't know. But it was early. It was probably 7 o'clock in the morning. I knock on the door, and the guy opens it up, and I remember he looked at me. He just looked at me. I go, water. It was like out of the TV, the car, water. And he looked at me, and he goes, where'd you come from? And I just pointed back there. And he looked at me, gave me a sort of once-over, and he says, meet me out back. And I went out to his backyard, and he hooked me up to his water hose. And I was like, drank a lot of water. And then the next thing I knew, I started hiking back towards the treatment center, and I found this little wash that I recognized the wash we'd hiked on, and I knew that was going to take me back to the treatment center. And I was back in another 45 minutes, and I come hiking in, and I went back to Dallas, and I started my recovery, which I've chronicled in some of the other previous talks, especially my first talk, the Val Kilmer story talk. And so I'd invite you to go listen to that to hear what happened for me afterwards. So to recap, we talked a little bit the concept of meditation. Don't stress yourself over, open yourself up to just, if you are distracted by thoughts, let them go, and just open yourself up. You never know what's going to happen. We talked about owl medicine. I'm running out of time here because I'm going to wrap this up on the hour. I'll tell you in another story how I ended up working with owl medicine and working with owl feathers, and I can give you a lot of really woo-woo stories about owl medicine subsequent to since I came back and started, developing my own spiritual program and bringing some of this work into my work with treatment clients. But bottom line is this: owl medicine is about the shadow and the being willing to look inside ourselves and the move into the darkness. And so I'll wrap this up by saying I regard that trip out into the desert as I didn't die physically, but I think you probably get a sense of it was a death and a rebirth, which is what we are all going through. I believe anybody picking up the feather for recovery, to follow a path, whatever that path is for you, picking up the feather to recovery is about beginning, as I said last week, shadow work. It's all about looking at myself and learning to be honest with myself. As it said with the owl, let's go back to this one. Owl can, use your powers of keen, silent observation to intuit some life situation. I was intuiting a life situation. I'm an addict, and it's going to kill me if I don't take this seriously. And then owl can bring you messages in the night through dreams or meditation. I had the owl out there in the desert with me, and man, did I ever get a message about my recovery. It seems to be working still today. So with that, look at that. I am right on the hour. every week it's gone like this. I'm in the flow here. So thanks for tuning in to Wednesday Woo. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about next week. Leave me comments in these as far as what kind of topics you'd like to hear about, and go back and listen to the previous talks and you get a sense of the things that I'm talking about in here, and give me some suggestions on what you'd like to hear more about. All right. Thanks, guys.